A move in the front office at Oregon has people talking about Big Ten expansion again. And as a result, Big Ten athletic directors are starting to pump the brakes. Why is that?
You are Locked On Big Ten, your daily podcast on the Big Ten Conference. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey, you're tuned in to Locked On Big Ten. Be sure to follow the show wherever you get your podcasts on YouTube and on Twitter at Locked On Big Ten. 10 when you're typing it out, not TEN. I'm your host, Nate Dickinson. Coming up on today's show, we're going to get into some of the first round matchups coming up in the NCAA tournament. But I want to start by talking about the latest expansion rumors surrounding the Big Ten. Now, we've got people talking about this constantly, it seems like now. But the latest piece of evidence to suggest that we could have Big Ten expansion sooner than later comes out of Eugene, Oregon, where the university has now hired John Carl Schultz as the new president at Oregon. Why is that significant? Well, he comes to Oregon from previously being the provost over at Wisconsin, and while he held that title, he was very, very publicly adamant about the Big Ten expanding more. So that, of course, rustles up the feathers and gets everyone talking about things again, including Rutgers athletic director Pat Hobbs. He went on a podcast earlier this week and said, and I quote, "You want to do things very carefully in a measured way. You want to be very mindful of the entire landscape. I like where we are. I know there's rumors out there of further expansion. I'm not giving away anything when I say this. I like where we are. I think what you want to do when you expand is you want to settle in, make sure it's all working very well before you think about other things. Now look, but you're always open to it. You hear rumors about what's happening with the ACC, the Big 12, all of these. So you just got to continue to watch." That was on the TKR podcast. So Hobbs pretty, I wouldn't say adamant, but making it very clearly known that he wants to slow things down as far as Big Ten expansion goes. And we've talked about this before. Part of the reason why Kevin Warren had a bit of a rift with the Big Ten's chancellors and presidents was because he was so vocal about wanting to continue expanding, or at least continue to look into expanding. And not everybody with the universities agreed with that sentiment. He's now leaving, and we have once again now an athletic director coming out and saying, hey, maybe let's slow down a little bit before we get into any more teams getting in. And to be fair, the point he makes, I don't think is one that's just out of nowhere. The idea of wanting to settle in, wanting to see what works and doesn't work is really, really important. As a matter of fact, Rutgers would be a perfect example of a team that was put into the Big Ten, and we're still maybe seeing whether or not that really, really works as a fit here into this conference. But that also brings me to my point here, which is that Rutgers and other schools like it may not want more Big Ten expansion because they're worried about what other teams are going to fit in as. They may be more worried about the fact that other teams may be better fits for the Big Ten than Rutgers or Maryland or anywhere else. Previously, when we've had this conversation, I've talked about the teams at the top wanting to maybe slow down on the expansion process. I'm talking about your Ohio States, I'm talking about your Michigans, the schools who already have all the power and may possibly see a school like a USC coming in and potentially taking away some of that power that they have as the top of what is right now possibly the biggest conference in all of college sports outside of maybe the SEC. That's an argument for another day. The point being that while the reasons for the teams at the top to be worried is pretty obvious, we haven't talked about the reasons for the team at the bottom to be worried all that much. And Rutgers is one of those teams. I guess I'll put it this way. The Big Ten is going to expand more. I think that's something that at the moment is inevitable unless something big changes at some point, whether it be this summer, whether it be next summer, or 5 summers from now. There is going to be more teams coming into the Big Ten. So when that happens, and when we get up to 20 teams in the Big Ten, let's say, I think there's a time, and I don't know when this is, where you have to look at the roster of Big Ten schools and look at a school like Rutgers and ask yourself, okay, we're all about getting the money. We're all about getting our schools the most money possible. And we're talking about adding an Oregon or a Washington team right now and putting them as a reduced pay cut compared to everybody else. But what happens if 5 years down the road, as AD Hobbs points out, and the fit is almost too good? What if Oregon comes in and starts competing for college football playoff spots right away? Then 5 years down the road, Oregon's going to be looking at the deal that they have and saying, wait a minute, why is it that we're not only not getting more than a school like Rutgers, who has done nothing as far as impacting the Big Ten's prestige, and in fact getting less than those kind of schools? So the schools at the top, of course, are worried about losing some of their power. The schools at the bottom could be at a much, much bigger risk, losing some of their money or losing their spot in the conference entirely. This is a conversation that I think is years and years down the road. But when it gets to the point where the Big Ten is at 18, 20 teams and continuing to look for more, at what point do you turn yourself around and take a look in the mirror? Look at the teams that you already have and ask yourself, okay, so what is it that Rutgers provides to the Big Ten Conference? Because at the moment, if you're looking at it right now, the answer is the basketball team beats Purdue once a year. And I've, of course, already mentioned Rutgers should be an NCAA tournament team. But the point is that that's not enough when you're talking about not only impact on sports, but also impact on sports when football is the one that drives everything here. So when you have a school like a Rutgers or a Maryland or even a Northwestern that really doesn't provide all that much in either sport, I feel like you're going to be looking at those schools at some point and asking yourself, why are they still here? The talk has been all about getting bigger, and it's going to continue to be about getting bigger because for at least the next few years, there's going to be an overflow of money for the Big Ten to try and spend and just grab power. So again, I don't think this is a conversation that's seriously had for a little while. But let's say that, again, you add Oregon into this conference, and even in 2 or 3 years, they're a much, much more impactful and competitive Big Ten team than Rutgers has ever been in its time here in the conference. At some point, if I'm, for example, John Carl Schultz, the new president of Oregon, I'm looking at this situation and asking the Big Ten Conference, hey, it makes no sense that Rutgers is making the same amount or potentially more than we are, depending on what this Oregon and Washington deal ends up being. My point is, for the small schools at the bottom, there is a legitimate concern, I believe, that at some point down the road, you could get cut off from this super conference. And again, it's a conversation that's years and years away from happening. But for one, that is something that can be accelerated if other schools start complaining about it. And two, that's what all these ADs are thinking about. They're thinking about years and years and down the road, whether it's a team that's for expansion or a team that's against expansion for what I guess we'd call the right reasons in trying to make sure the Big Ten is healthy, or the wrong reasons, the selfish reasons of trying to make sure their school is getting theirs. It's much more than just Ohio State and Michigan worrying about staying at the top of the conference. It's also, in my eyes, very much about a Rutgers or a Maryland or a Northwestern or any other school that honestly doesn't make a huge impact in football. Like having a huge impact in basketball, if you're an Indiana or a Purdue or something like that, I think that matters a little bit more. But if you're one of those other schools that's not doing anything in football and really only kind of keeping up in basketball, there's a legit reason to be concerned about what happens when the other powerhouse schools get in. Because go ahead and take your pick. Let's say 5 years from now, the Big Ten has 20 teams and they want to get back down to 18. Is USC or UCLA leaving? No, they're not. Washington and Oregon, if they're the next two teams in, they're not leaving either. Those are good football programs. If any team is going to get cut off at any point, it's going to be one of those smaller schools. And to be completely honest, this is probably a conversation that isn't had until after 2030, when the media rights deal is up and a new one is set to come up here. Because it's, of course, all sorts of complicated to try and get in and out of those deals, as we've already seen in the ACC. So if anything's going to happen next, you have to realize that while expansion may be a near obvious good thing for the Big Ten Conference in the ability to add high prestige schools. You also have to realize that these schools are not thinking about the Big Ten Conference when voicing their opinions. They're thinking about their individual institutions. And while that's obvious, what may be a little less obvious right now is that some of these lower tier Big Ten teams are thinking more about keeping themselves alive in the conference than just keeping the power and the money. It is much more of a dire situation if you're one of those teams that just is not producing the results that, of course, the teams at the top are. So while the complaints of Ohio State and Michigan may seem a little silly because you know they're going to be powerful no matter what, when you have other schools down at the bottom who are also against things, that's when you're able to come together and agree as a conference that, hey, let's hold off for a little bit, even if it is the right thing to do for the conference long term. I'm not saying that Hobbs's claims are incorrect. Yes, you probably should see if a team is a real legitimate fit before you go out and spending more money on more teams. But at the same time, I don't think that's why you come out and say so on a podcast. I think the reason you do that is because you're legitimately scared of what happens when more powerful teams, and obviously more powerful teams, are joining the conference, and the money is still heading to you. Because at some point, someone's going to come after that money. And right now, they've all got pretty much a pretty good argument as to why they should be getting more than a Rutgers, than a Maryland, than a Northwestern, or whoever school you think is at the bottom of the barrel in the Big Ten. It's an interesting thing to think about because it's, of course, just another thing that complicates stuff, which isn't a surprise in college sports. But for something that seems so obvious as, like, again, getting rid of divisions, well, why would any team in the West want to get rid of divisions? It gives them a chance to play in the Big Ten title game that, to be honest, they probably would not have in the near future. Same kind of deal. The teams that are at the bottom don't want change because they're afraid of how far lower they're going to fall on the totem pole. We'll talk more, I'm sure, about expansion as the offseason gears up, but right now we've got March Madness to get into. A whole lot of Big Ten teams have Locked On shows, but a couple don't. So while we're going to talk to Locked On hosts here throughout the week about their games, I want to get into a couple of the matchups between Maryland and Arkansas, and then Maryland and West Virginia, I apologize, and then Illinois and Arkansas. We'll get to those here in just a minute on Locked On Big Ten. Before we do that, though, the midway point of the NBA season has come and gone, which means we're into the home stretch, and it's the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. All you have to do is download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on anything from the money line to point spreads, props, anything that you want to find. You can get it over at FanDuel. It is your place to go for any of your sports betting needs, including NIT lines. NIT starts up today. We're going to tell you the lines that we have from FanDuel at the back end of the show. If you want to bet alongside us or bet against us, any line that you hear on Locked On is coming from FanDuel. So play along with us over at FanDuel Sportsbook and get that no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to get that no-sweat first bet and make sure that you're starting things off on a high note, win or lose. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Also, grab your bracket and go listen to the Locked On College Basketball Bracket Breakdown. With national analysis and insights from our local experts, the Locked On College Basketball Bracket Breakdown has everything you need to make the most informed decisions about your bracket. Find the episode of Locked On College Basketball wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube too. All right, let's dive into a couple of the games here featuring Big Ten teams in the first round. There are going to be a couple of close ones. And again, we don't have Locked On hosts for every Big Ten team yet. So I wanted to get into a couple of the games where we don't have anyone to bring in and talk to you about them so we don't miss anything. I want to first talk about Maryland as an 8 seed facing off against the 9 seed in West Virginia. And I think the biggest key here is for Maryland to be able to jump on that West Virginia defense. West Virginia is not a very good defensive team. They give up over 70 points per game. It's barely inside the top 200 in Division I as far as points that they allow. And of course, Maryland has some high quality scorers that can take advantage of that. So if the Terrapins are able to get hot early on offense, there's a chance that they can run away from this game. That's, I think, the biggest positive going into it if you're a Terrapin fan. I can see the Terps blowing out the Mountaineers in this game. I do not see it the other way around. I don't see a situation where West Virginia just runs away from things in this matchup. They're going to want to try and slow things down a little bit more. Now, what will be the Achilles heel for Maryland? They kind of stay out of foul trouble. There is a situation where West Virginia ends up getting a whole bunch of fouls on Maryland and making things really, really hard for them. And that's been one of the biggest plagues for them all season. Not a super deep lineup. So when a couple of players end up having to sit on the bench, the quality of that Maryland team really does take a step down. And to add on top of it, West Virginia does a lot of things really, really well to help draw fouls from other teams too. First off, they're a really good offensive rebounding team, which is something that I'm not sure how to really measure as a factor of how it results in fouls. But the point is, if a team gets an offensive rebound, quick putback, really any sort of second chance point really ups the chances that you're going to foul somebody on that second chance. It's a rebound, you're out of position, you got to reach over. Basketball, you know how basketball works. The other bigger point is, on paper, West Virginia and the teams that they play, I should say, opposing teams against West Virginia commit 21.5 fouls per game. So the teams that West Virginia play are committing 21.5 fouls each time out on average. That's the fourth most in the country. So West Virginia knows how to draw a foul. Maryland can become susceptible to foul trouble. If the Terrapins can stay out of that foul trouble in this game, I think they win this game. And if they can really play well as far as keeping everyone out on the floor, I don't think there's a question that Maryland's the better team and they win this game pretty handily. The only really concern I have is what happens when people have to take a step off the court. When you have to go deeper and deeper into that bench, can Maryland keep up? I think they can keep up. But can they go out and win this game if they don't have their best guys out there for the full 40 minutes? That's the biggest question between Maryland and West Virginia. I think Maryland's the much better team if you're just looking at their best against the Mountaineers' best. But the question is, will Maryland's best be out there for the entirety of the game? We'll see what ends up happening. Keeping the ball outside is key. West Virginia is not used to winning games outside from the arc. And of course, that's again where the fouls happen, is inside, whether it's offensive or defensive. Maryland, I think, wants to keep this game out on the perimeter and should really, really focus on locking things up inside to a point where they're not really even letting the ball get that deep into the post as much as possible. We'll see what ends up happening, but I think that that's my biggest key to the game right there, is for Maryland, stay out of the foul trouble, keep the ball outside, really on both ends of the court, but especially on defense. Try to make West Virginia work from the perimeter. If they can do that, I'm seeing a real opportunity at a big and easy win here for the Mountaineers. The other game that I wanted to touch on, Illinois is a 9 seed facing off against the Arkansas Razorbacks as an 8 seed. This has a chance to be a really, really low scoring game. Both of these teams are good on defense. Arkansas is really good on the inside on defense. Illinois is just statistically, as far as like the efficiency ratings go, a really, really good defensive team. But at the same time, both of these teams, I think, as a result of that, are going to want to run a little bit faster, try to get fast break points, and try to avoid going into a half-court set where they then have to work around their offense, especially on the Illinois side. We have seen, if you've watched Illinois basketball, how good this team can be in transition and doing things like that for stretches. And for 8-10-minute stretches of games, they look like sometimes the Globetrotters, in the way that they're able to move the ball around, go inside, then kick back out, and really run an efficient offense when things are clicking. However, when things aren't clicking, things get very, very sloppy for the Illini. So there's, of course, a give and take there. But if you're looking at this matchup, you've got an Arkansas team that has a couple of really, really good shot blockers inside, and also an ability to, I'd say, be a little bit more lackluster on the outside on defense. Now, again, Illinois' kick and drive has been a big part of their offense as well. I think the question lies on how sustainable is the fast break, and if both teams end up trying to speed things up, which is something I'm kind of anticipating, who ends up playing a cleaner game? I would suggest Illinois has that, but that's partially because I haven't watched really much of any Arkansas basketball. But again, the point is that Illinois, I know, when they're working well, can run up and down the court with anyone in the country. One of the best offensive fast break teams, again, for an 8 or 10 minute stretch that we've seen throughout the tournament. And that's been the big consensus on Illinois ever since the bracket was announced. As a 9 seed coming in, if they're clicking and get hot, they can knock off a 1 seed in that second round. That's the kind of skill this team has. But everyone also agrees that Illinois has not shown that consistency at all throughout the season. It's there for a little bit, but as far as keeping it for a full 40 minutes, nonetheless 5 games, there's a reason to believe that Illinois could lose to a lesser team and also beat a team much better than it. So if you're picking brackets, go ahead and put Illinois into the Sweet 16 if you like, because that's a team that can go on a run, but they could also get blown out by Arkansas in this first round game too. For Illinois, I say work around quickly, use that quickness to get the shots inside when you can on the fast break, and then try to then establish the outside shot that I think you're going to need after Arkansas ends up settling in on defense. That's the kind of stuff that gets Illinois this win. But really, I'm really excited to watch this game because I think it has a chance to either be really low scoring if both defenses are able to settle in, or if they start running up and down the court, just be a crazy, hectic, classic March Madness game. This is a game that I'm really, really excited to watch because of how fun I think these two teams can be to watch when they get out on the floor. I mean, Eric Musselman, we know, does a good job with his squad and making sure they're always competitive. Brad Underwood has an exciting team as well, too. It's one of the first round matchups I'm most looking forward to seeing in this tournament. Again, those are just a couple of the teams of the very few that we don't have podcasts for here on the Locked On Podcast Network just yet. Always more coming on and adding more shows. So we talk about those now. We'll talk more with other Big Ten hosts about their teams' games as we continue along with the week here on Locked On Big Ten. Let's wrap things up today by talking about Big Ten news from around the conference. Maryland has hired a new offensive coordinator on the football field. Josh Gaddis is the new OC and quarterbacks coach for the Terrapins. He was formerly Miami's offensive coordinator last season, where he averaged 23.6 points per game. That offense did nothing special, but we'll see what he can do with the Terrapins. In other news, Iowa will pay all $4 million of a settlement to a group of former Black football players who sued the school for racial discrimination. It was previously already set that Iowa would pay $2 of that $4 million. A decision made by the state here this week says that Iowa will pay all $4 of that $4 million instead of the university paying $2 and the state paying $2. Not a great look, guys. And even worse, State Auditor Rob Sand called for the firing of Gary Barta in this decision as well. Called it ridiculous that the state would even have to negotiate or argue that they shouldn't be paying this settlement. And he also points out this is the 4th discrimination settlement Iowa has had to make under Barta. Yeah, that's not good. That's very much not good. To give a fair shake to the Iowa side of things, Kirk Ferentz did say previously that he had wished the school had not gone to a settlement, as of course he believed that he was not in the wrong in whatever it was that happened within that suit. We do have players of the week to tell you about from across the conference. I'll go through just really quickly. In baseball, Nebraska's Cole Evans is the player of the week. In Rutgers, Ben Gorski and Jake Marshall are the pitchers of the week. In softball, Indiana's Taryn Kern and Minnesota's Autumn Pease are pitchers. In softball, Indiana's Taryn Kern is player of the week. Minnesota's Autumn Pease is the pitcher of the week. And in men's gymnastics, Penn State's Josh Karnas is the men's gymnast of the week. NIT brackets announced, and they start here tonight. Nebraska women has been selected to the women's NIT tournament, and Michigan, Rutgers, and Wisconsin, the 3 bubble teams who did not make the NCAA tournament, all selected to the NIT starting tonight. All 3 will also be hosting their first round games tonight. I mentioned earlier we do have betting lines for those NIT games, courtesy of FanDuel. Michigan is minus 6.5 against Toledo this evening. Wisconsin's minus 2.5 against Bradley. Again, making it to the NIT, if you're one of those mid-major schools, means that you could have finished at the top of their conference in the regular season. So when you see a mid-major name, doesn't mean that it's just a pushover. But I'd still take the Big Ten in both those matchups. At home, Michigan minus 6.5, Wisconsin minus 2.5. But we won't talk all that much about NIT games here on the show. I know that. Thanks for making Locked On Big Ten your first listen every single day. As we wrap up the show, make your second listen Locked On College Basketball. Experts Isaac Shade and Andy Patton bring you everything you need to know on and off the court. Plus, hear from big-name experts, coaches, and players throughout the basketball landscape. Locked On College Basketball, available on YouTube and wherever you get podcasts. Be sure to follow along with Locked On Big Ten too, wherever you get your podcasts on YouTube and on Twitter. It's at Locked On Big Ten, 10 at the end, not TEN. I'm Nate Dickinson at Nate with Sports. We're back tomorrow with more basketball analysis leading up to the tourney, and of course, more on anything else that happens in the Big Ten going into the day. I'm Nate Dickinson with Locked On.